Good evening. I'm Ron Perrin, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Political Theory at the University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of this year's presidential lectures and to point out that this is the beginning of the 18th year of such lectures. We have now had over 180 speakers visit our campus and enlighten us with respect to a great many things. That tradition will continue tonight, I can assure you. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to make a few acknowledgments. First, of course, to President Dennison, with his sustained, continued, and strong support of the lecture series. Secondly, to his wife Jane, who is ever the gracious host for the speakers and is always there, particularly when George has to be away, which is quite often. Third, to Richard Drake, professor of history, who has been the organizer and good shepherd of this series now for several years. And then, especially this evening, I need to announce that this is the first annual Ezio Capodaccia Memorial Lecture on Politics and History. Ezio was a professor of European Studies and History at McMaster University in Ontario for several years. By all accounts, a remarkable scholar, teacher, and friend, in particular to our good shepherd, Richard Drake. His wife, Helen, has endowed this series, which will begin tonight and will continue, we hope, for several years to come, along with the position of scholarship in the Department of History. And Helen, I would appreciate if you would stand and let these people acknowledge you and your support. It's people like this who help make this university such a special place. Now to the business at hand. Our guest this evening is Dr. Anatoli Lieven, currently a senior research fellow on U.S. foreign policy at the New American Foundation in Washington, D.C. Before taking up his position at the New America Foundation, he was Senior Associate for Foreign and Security Policy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Dr. Lieven holds a doctorate in political science from Jesus College in Cambridge, England. He's also studied at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi and Troy State University in Alabama. But most definitely, he is not an armchair or ivory tower scholar. From 1988 to 1996, he served as a foreign correspondent for the Times of London, first covering the Afghan War and the Soviet withdrawal, later the former Soviet Union and Russia. And unlike what some of us might suspect, there's a good bit of difference between academia and the experience of warfare. In 1997-98, working for the Financial Times of London, he covered the crucial revolutionary events taking place in Central Europe. From these experiences, he produced a host of articles and 2 books, most notably The Baltic Revolution, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence, which was winner of the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the Yale University Press Governor's Award. There is a long and venerable tradition in which visitors from abroad gain insight into our national character that too often escapes our own attention. Their work is characterized by 3 features. First, they are keenly observant of our demographic composition, how our physical environment shapes our values and mores. Secondly, they are sympathetic to what we have as our best aspirations and what our shared values are. And third, they are critical when, where, and how we prove unable to measure up to those same aspirations and unable to embody those same values. Most notable among these visitors, of course, was the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, who authored his classic study of democracy in America in the 19th century. I believe that Dr. Lieven is squarely within that tradition. To his credit and our good fortune, since 9/11, he has turned his attention to the consequences of that event and subsequent developments for American foreign policy. The result is his recently published book, America, Right or Wrong, An Anatomy of American Nationalism. Here he provides an historical, a political, and a cultural context to such events as the invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq. It is a context that is invaluable as we try to understand what has happened to us since that tragic event. It is a context from which I, and judging from the response to his work, some of it with great chagrin, others have learned a great deal. After his lecture, in response to questions from the audience tonight, Dr. Lieven will be available for a book signing in the foyer of the theater. Now, please join me in welcoming to our university and our community Dr. Anatoli Lieven. His topic tonight, City on a Hill, an Embattled Fortress, An Anatomy of American Nationalism.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all coming, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be giving this Ezio Cappadocia memorial lecture, particularly as a historian. I'm not really a social scientist at all. I'm a complete fraud. I'm delighted to give a lecture named after a fellow historian, and I'm very grateful to Mrs. Cappadocia for funding this series. I'm also delighted and flattered far beyond my deserts to be included in a series which includes Robert Bellah, a man who, though I've never met him, alas, has had a profound impact on my own work and on my own knowledge and views of America. Robert Bellah forms a surviving part, one of the few survivors, alas, of a great generation of American critical scholarship about America, and a generation which grew up, in some ways, in circumstances analogous to our own today. As a result of Pearl Harbor, and then the struggle with Soviet communism, America was, in a sense, dragged into the world in a way that it had never been before. This was an experience which a great many Americans, of course, found extremely uncomfortable and indeed unwelcome. They found themselves in circumstances of involvement with the world, which were quite unfamiliar to them historically, and dealing with challenges with which they were quite unfamiliar. And the response to these challenges was, on the one hand, absolutely necessary, of critical, vital importance to the preservation of democratic civilization in the world, but also, shall we say, in certain aspects, had a tendency to fly to extremes, in the form of McCarthyism at home and later the Vietnam War abroad. And out of this, and out of also the infusion of American scholarship, with the impact of scholarship and refugee scholarship from Europe, came this great generation of American scholars, of names like Gunnar Myrdal, Richard Hofstadter, Lewis Hartz, Lewis and Clark. Even in 2 days, I've been somewhat exposed to their influence. And Robert Bellah. And I mean, my work, as you can imagine, has very widely been accused of being anti-American. And I've sort of cheaped pathetically in useless protest that it is in fact almost entirely based on American scholarship and American perceptions, above all from this great generation. And one of the purposes of my own work was to try to do something to bring some of their work back into the public arena. Because I have been struck, and I must say also horrified, by the degree to which, though of course these names are remembered and honoured in academia, they have been almost forgotten, insofar as I suppose they were ever known, in the world of public policy and analysis in Washington and elsewhere. And I'm continually confronted by students from Washington universities aspiring to jobs in the State Department, in the CIA, in the government, in policy institutes, who, if you mention to them the name of Myrdal, they have a kind of hangdog look because they know they ought to have read him, but they haven't. If you mention a name like Reinhold Niebuhr, they have more of a sheepish look because they know they ought to have heard of him, but they haven't. If you mention the name of Lewis Hartz, their faces become of the general shape and appearance of a mollusk, totally round and blank, no impact at all. And unfortunately, as a result, America is sending out into the world representatives who, because they have very little real sense of their own country and the origins of the American system, the bases of American political culture, are severely disabled when it comes to actually representing America in the world, understanding the reactions of other countries to America, but also understanding their own deeper political culture and motivations for what they're doing. Now, in celebrating this great generation of American critical analysts, particularly as a foreigner, naturally, it's very important always to remember and to point out that the reason that it is so important to understand and bring out the reasons for some of the vices of the American system and tradition, as well as its virtues, is not, as the old left would have it, that America is particularly bad, because it isn't. I'm quite convinced, as were most of this generation, that American democracy, the example of American democracy, is of critical value and critical importance to the world. The reason why it's necessary to focus, as Senator Fulbright advised us, on the shadows as well as the light of the American tradition, is not that America is particularly bad, but simply that America is particularly powerful and influential. You're very welcome in the questions afterwards, if you so wish, to abuse the British tradition to the very limit of your ability, and I promise I won't resent it. But in a certain sense, there's not much point, because Britain has a very limited influence and role in the world now. Clearly, a country which is so influential in the world also has a particular need and even duty to examine itself. Now, in seeking to understand some of the origins of American nationalism and the American political tradition which it has shaped, I was drawn back and back and back into history to the total bewilderment, it must be said, of my colleagues at the Carnegie. You know, I retreated from century to century until I left America altogether and ended up back in 16th century Scotland. But obviously, as Dr. Perrin said, the immediate impetus to this work was contemporary events, and particularly the Iraq War, because I strongly supported the war in Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I regarded that as entirely necessary and just. But it's true that I was quite horrified, not just by the decision to go to war in Iraq, but the nature of the debate in this country, or perhaps one should say lack of debate to a great extent, leading up to that war. And part of the reason for my horror was at the way in which nationalism and the accusation of lack of patriotism was used with, I'm afraid, great success to stifle dissent and opposition in this country. I mean, I know so many people in Washington, D.C., in politics, in the think tank world, who in private were deeply opposed to that war, and for reasons which I'm afraid have become all too miserably justified by the event, but who would admit quite frankly in private that given the mood which had been created, for the sake of their careers and for the sake of retaining any kind of public influence, they just did not dare to speak out. I found that not merely a very dangerous and depressing thing for American democracy today, but I also found it a phenomenon which has extremely dark echoes in the history of nationalism in Europe, for example. The second impetus, which led to a particular focus of my work, was summed up by a former US Special Forces officer, Colonel Pat Lang, who served in Vietnam and who is now an expert on counterterrorism. And he said recently in Washington that, in a way, in Iraq and in Vietnam, we invaded the same country. But it wasn't the real country. It was a country of our imaginations. A country which was yearning for democracy, in which the people would welcome America to fight against a small number of evil enemies who, once removed or defeated, the country would flourish in peace, and so forth and so on. And he said, you know, we should have spent much less time before the Iraq War thinking about Iraq. Not that actually we did spend much time thinking about Iraq. We should have spent much more time thinking about America and what it was that produced this imaginary country in so many minds. And lastly, and this leads me to the actual structure of this book and much of my recent work, I was deeply struck by the really radical, as I would see it, contradictions, but I think as a large part of the world sees it, between, on the one hand, an apparently quite genuine commitment on the part of many neoconservatives in particular, but also more widely in the American establishment, a real commitment to the spreading of democracy and freedom in the world, coupled with a quite radical contempt for the democratic opinion of that world in general, and of the Arab world in particular, who these people said that they were going to democratize. Now, the longer I stayed and examined this phenomenon, the more I realized, however, that this was not, as some critics would say, simply a matter of hypocrisy, or certainly not conscious hypocrisy, that it was rather a case of different but very, very ancient and deeply rooted traditions in American political culture and nationalism running together, and sometimes merging, sometimes separating, but always being there. And out of this came the dialectical plan for my work, which was partly, I don't mean this in any sense as a sort of rigorous, dogmatic, theoretical framework, but as a kind of organizing principle. The principle, first, of the thesis, the American thesis, as it has been widely called, or the American creed, a civic nationalist thesis based on universal values of democracy, human rights, civil rights, free speech, the Constitution, which are meant to be applicable to the whole of humanity. The antithesis, a chauvinist nationalism based to a considerable extent on an idea of American culture, which is not actually spreadable to the rest of mankind, and even a severe doubt about whether the rest of mankind is capable of adopting democracy at all, or whether the forms of democracy that it adopts are in fact corrupt and evil, and not like American democracy. Hence, once again, the rather weird combination of preaching democracy, but of contempt for the other developed democracies of the world when they disagreed with America. Now, as you know, under the old dialectical formula, you're supposed to have a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis, which takes both the theoretical analysis, but also the plan for practical action to a higher level. What I got, and what rather more importantly America got, was a thesis, an antithesis, and George Bush, who has in many ways combined these two elements of the American nationalist tradition with, up to quite recently at least, quite remarkable success in domestic political terms, to the extent that it often seems as if the democratic opposition has been almost crippled and silenced, has ceased to be a genuine opposition. The problem is that it works very well within America, this mixture, this merging of these two traditions. It doesn't really work outside America at all, and therefore it is a very questionable support for American foreign policy. Now, to give an image of the dialectical nature of American nationalism through history, one could well resort to the phrase which is the origin of the title of this lecture. Perhaps the oldest, the most famous, and also the most moving of phrases about the American national identity and America's mission in the world, that of the city on the hill, the light to the nations. America as an example of a good, decent, human, law-abiding governing system responsible to the wishes of its people and a model to the rest of mankind. Now, this is an image that has inspired not only Americans throughout their history, even before the American Revolution, of course, but also many people around the world. It would be a tragedy indeed if the power of this image were to be diminished by American actions. One should note, however, I don't think anyone actually has noted this, although I speak under correction, that there is, in the very image of the city on the hill, a profound ambiguity. Why have people throughout history built cities on hills? Not as a light or image to their neighbors, but because they were afraid of their neighbors. They built cities on hills for defense, for protection against their neighbors. The origins of this phrase are, of course, biblical. Alas, if you went to the Holy Land today and looked for cities on hills, one would find them most strikingly, even classically expressed, in the Jewish settlements on the West Bank. Those in Gaza have gone, of course, which are very generally built upon hills for protection against the deeply embittered, ferociously angry and hate-filled surrounding Palestinian populations in the valleys and on the plains. And when I draw attention to this duality of the phrase, the city on the hill, I'm not just engaging in a kind of intellectual debating point. It's intended to bring out a fundamental truth about the English, the Scottish, and the Ulster or Scots-Irish Protestant traditions from which America had its ultimate origins in the English colonies in North America, which then gave rise to the United States. Because, on the one hand, Protestant England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, like Holland and Scandinavia and the other Protestant states, saw themselves, of course, as a light to the whole world. Their Protestant culture was naturally intended to be universal. Protestantism was meant to succeed Catholicism as a universal religion. This truth was apprehendable to all mankind. This was the new Israel, the bearer of God's word in the world, but also the bearer not just of a religious idea, but in those days, of course, ideas of religious identity and religious society were indivisible from the idea of what constituted a civilization, a good society in general. And of course, at the heart of this, as in the Protestant Reformation from its very beginning, was the idea that this new truth, based on old Christian truths, was to be spread to the world by teaching, by preaching, by voluntary conversion. But From the very first, of course, these Protestant societies were also embattled islands, fortresses, in a hostile Catholic sea. And indeed, the very use for all these countries of the phrase the New Israel naturally brought with it, and was from the very first consciously intended to do so, the notion of also bearers of God's word surrounded by infidels or pagans or anyway enemies, Amalekites, Philistines, and so on. And as indeed in the Old Testament itself, defense also became offense. Wars of defense against, in England, Scotland, wars of defense against Catholic Spain and France became wars of conquest and oppression in Ireland. And not just conquest, but also the dispossession of land and the imposition of ferocious oppression on the native Catholic Irish population. And as has so often been described by American historians, a very large part of this tradition also came over to the colonies in New America. From the very start, the god of Protestantism in America was also a god of war, and had to be, in the wars against the Indians, the wars against the French, and so on. This was true of the original Puritans in New England, but it was even more deeply true, of course, of the later generations of Scots-Irish settlers from Ulster, steeled in this war against the Irish Catholics. And of course, once again, as has so often been remarked, the attitudes in which they were steeled were then applied with even greater ferocity to the Native American population, and not in terms of war, but in terms of repression to the black population in the South. So down the centuries, the mild Protestant preacher and the Cromwellian trooper have marched through the generations, arm in arm. The metaphor is not exact because it implies, in a sense, an equality between them. And at no moment has this been true. For very long periods, both in domestic affairs, perhaps even more strikingly in international affairs, the Cromwellian trooper has shrunk so much that he's even, in a sense, been put into the pocket of the minister and has travelled there. Hasn't gone away, but he's travelled there, quietly, not doing anything very much. Overall, throughout American history, it must be said that the preacher has predominated. If he hadn't, then we would not be here today in a liberal American democracy. We would be in something very different and much nastier. Equally, I think it must be recognized that for very extensive periods, with regards to people who we would now regard as Americans, but who were not regarded then, it's been the preacher who's been put in the trooper's pocket. That was true, of course, of the treatment of the blacks for most of American history. It was also true of the frontier and the treatment of the Native Americans. And one emblematic moment, Scots-Irish moment, if you like, for this, was, of course, the deportation of the Cherokees, for which Andrew Jackson famously essentially gave his approval, overruling or ignoring in the process a decision by the US Supreme Court with the famous phrase, "Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." That was a moment when the preacher was put firmly in the trooper's pocket and told to go away. And of course, this approach echoed directly Cromwell's approach to the Catholic Irish when he said that they had a choice. They could go to Connaught or hell. They could face deportation or extermination, in other words. Now, of course, the preacher and the trooper have changed enormously over time. Not suggesting for a second that we're living in the mid-17th century. I would say, though, that the changes have been organic rather than radical. The trooper, perhaps, has changed in some ways rather less than the preacher. If you look at a figure like General Boykin, for example, it really does not take much imagination to see him in the ranks of Cromwell's army. You remember the general who declared that, our God is bigger than their God. A straight reference, by the way, to the book of Isaiah, a very popular book with Cromwell's troopers. It was Isaiah confronting the priests of Baal and defeating them in contest because his God was more powerful than theirs. On the side of the preacher, or to return to my dialectical framework, the American thesis, of course, the greatest change since those days was the infusion of the American civic identity with the values of the Enlightenment, expressed in the American Constitution. Values which, however, as I pointed out in a lecture earlier today, were also considerably infused by a specifically Protestant sense of man's sinfulness and untrustworthiness, something which is responsible for the checks and balances of the American Constitution, and the difference, for example, between the American tradition of the political Enlightenment and the French one. But I think one can definitely see a fusion in what was to become the American civic nationalist tradition of these older Protestant forms, which are, of course, also associated with a specific sense that English governing forms, inherited from the English tradition, also represented a superior form of civilization, most notable of which, of course, trial by jury and the entire common law legal system. And out of this has come the American civic nationalism, which continues in many ways to provide America's public face today. This is the thesis about themselves that Americans tell to themselves and to the world. And it derives from the older Protestant tradition. I think, at least this is one of its roots, the sense of being not just a superior form of government, but the valid form of government for the world, and as representing not just a form of government, but also representing a civilization, and in a way the only valid civilization, the only valid way of life. This element of civic and even civilizational nationalism was then, in my view, over time, strengthened and even necessitated by a central and specific feature of the United States throughout its modern history, which is America as an immigrant society. Because if in one way the American tradition displays really striking continuities, as Samuel Huntington has pointed out, there's this automatic trope which sees America as a new country compared to Europe, which is very odd, because America has by far the oldest constitution in the world, the oldest political parties, the oldest continual political tradition, has in many ways changed far less than most European countries, which during the period of America's existence have gone through half a dozen revolutions. Even Britain has changed far more constitutionally and politically since the late 18th century than America has. So in one way, these traditions in America are very old and very continuous. In another way, however, of course, ethnically, America has changed colossally over time, repeatedly, and continues to do so. In another sense, therefore, America as a country is continually being recreated as a nation. Periods which in European history lasted for a particular time, of the period of the creation of nations, and was then considered to be finished, have in America repeated themselves over time. I'm not saying, by the way, that in Europe they are finished, because thanks to immigration, we may well have to go through this whole process over again of reinventing ourselves, or trying to. But certainly until recently, the basic European assumption was that France had been made and that's that. Britain had been made, or England had been made and that's that, and so forth and so on. There are good and bad aspects to this continual reinvention of America when it comes to American civic nationalism. The good one, which we could well do to learn from in Europe, is that it leads to a continual reaffirmation of the values of the American creed, of commitment to democracy. And of course that because this is a universal value, it is open to all mankind in the form of immigrants to America to accept and to become Americans thereby. something which we're wrestling with in Europe now and in many ways are getting dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. There is a somewhat dangerous aspect, however, one side of which was expressed in the famous remark by the French historian Ernest Renan, that in order to become a nation, a people must have many things in common, but they must also have forgotten many things. And I think that one aspect of America, of this continual recreation of the American nation, is a certain almost conscious amnesia. It's forgetting about many aspects of American history in order that the nation can be brought together and unified. And so one has songs, in school about how America has always welcomed people of all races to America's shores. Well, yes, but not quite as they mean it. Or a film, The Patriot, which you may have seen with Mel Gibson, which, as you can imagine, as a loyal British subject, I had problems with, although I have to say on that aspect it was completely justified. What was perhaps not so justified was the portrayal of the South Carolina militia in the War of Independence as a home of budding racial equality and mutual respect. I hadn't heard that before I saw that film, I must say. The other problem about the creation, the recreation, the continual recreation of the American nation through this civic nationalist creed was remarked on by Tocqueville, by the way, to whom I'm deeply grateful for the comparison, but I must reject it. 150 years ago, in which he did remark on a certain conformism in this country, a conformism greater in some respects than that in many of the authoritarian societies of Europe at the time, because in Europe it was imposed by some kind of autocratic monarchy, and the population spent its time trying to get away from this. And therefore, by the way, there was more respect for dissent, because dissent, required physical as well as moral courage. Whereas, as Tocqueville remarked, in America, the conformism, in a sense, comes up from the people and from the culture of the people, and is therefore more universal, or can be, and more stifling. And this is summed up in two classical phrases by some of the scholars who I mentioned. One by Richard Hofstadter, who remarked that it has been our fate as a nation not to have an ideology, but to be one. In other words, that the values of American civic nationalism infuse this society to such an extent, it's actually very difficult to step outside them and criticize them. The other was by Lewis Hart, who remarked, and one can sort of hear a certain weariness, that even a good idea can be rather frightening when it's the only idea a man has ever had. And I have, I must say, been concerned in recent years by the way in which this hegemony of a set of values which are of tremendous importance and virtue in themselves can lead to and can be used to stifle dissent. Auden talked during the Cold War of words as black magic, as a way in which you could use an accusation of communism simply to discredit any opposition and stifle a debate. But it's also true that positive words can be used in a way as black magic. And I have to say, I've observed on occasions in Washington the almost Pavlovian power of words like freedom and democracy to stop people thinking, certainly to stop people criticizing. Because in a sense, if not of course that I'm in any sense, or any of the doubters about aspects of the Bush administration's program, that we are opposed to freedom or democracy, but there are, as I think we can see, serious questions about how applicable these ideas may be to certain foreign societies at certain times. But there has been a real tendency to label people who raise these doubts as somehow outside the American national consensus and therefore as illegitimate. That's the use at home. Abroad, of course, and it's part of the same phenomenon, it can contribute to a certain messianism, to American belief in America's right and ability to spread its system, or the values of democracy and freedom, to other countries. And here is where one aspect of the American thesis can fuse with one aspect of the American antithesis. Because, I'm afraid, even on the part of convinced civic nationalists, people with a deep belief in freedom, freedom of speech, and the rule of law, there is, seen from the outside world, one rather curious aspect of this desire to spread freedom and democracy, which is that there is a tendency to try and spread them without actually asking the people on the other end whether they want to be democratized. And here is where the thesis and the antithesis, as I say, can flow together. Because it's not that the antithesis, which I will try to delineate more exactly in a minute, is formally opposed to the American thesis, to the values of the American creed, to democracy and the Constitution. On the contrary, these values are almost universally shared within America. In his great book of 1944, The Negro Dilemma, by which he also meant the American dilemma, Gunnar Myrdal remarked on this in The White South. He would remark how white Southerners would speak to him with every appearance of complete sincerity, of their devotion to the Constitution, to equality, to the rule of law, to civic rights, and indeed, in the context of the Second World War, to spreading these all over the world, would in the next sentence explain why all this was totally inapplicable to the position of the blacks in the South, without actually, once again, this wasn't conscious hypocrisy, just with no awareness that any contradiction there could possibly exist. So, I mean, it's not that people are, from the antithesis, are in revolt against the values of democracy as such, or in revolt against spreading them in the world, insofar as in one way this is an aspect of American national greatness, which they share. There is a considerable difference in how long they're prepared to spend preaching these values before they reach for the gun. But in one way, there is a unity with the preachers of democracy from the civic nationalist tradition, and that is that once again, you don't ask the other side. You don't consult them. The civic nationalists would spend longer trying to preach before reaching for the gun, but they wouldn't ask the people on the other end what they actually thought about the process. And you see this, I'm afraid, also in so much of the emphasis which one now hears among the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, on what's called public diplomacy, on essentially propagandizing, preaching, especially over the airwaves and through television, to other societies. I've had many, many discussions with Democrat friends in Washington, as well as with Republicans, and not just about public diplomacy, but about diplomacy in general. And again I've heard, we must talk to our allies, we must seek to convince our allies, we must persuade our allies to do what we want. And I've generally ended after a while of this saying, how about listening to your allies? That thought had not occurred to them, I must say, in most cases. There is, however, underlying this, also a key difference, I would say, between the American thesis and what I've described as the nationalist antithesis in America. And it's something as well which links the American dialectic to certain other countries in the world, France and India in particular. France and India, too, both have what can be described as civic nationalist theses, which for most of history have also been the official national ideology and national thesis, based on what are believed to be and are presented as, and which indeed in many ways are, universal values. In both these countries and in America, what has characterized the antithesis has been a sense, whether explicit in France or and India, or implicit in America, that actually this isn't true. that these aren't universal values, that these are values generated by American culture, by our specific national culture. This is the specifically American form of this. But that, in any case, the national identity is not formed on the basis of adherence to certain universal values. It's formed on the basis of a culture, whether it's an ethnic culture or a religious culture or some fusion of the two or a culture shaped by history. In any case, it's for us and not for the rest of the world. Now, here there is admittedly a very considerable difference between America, if you like, the nationalist right or the radical right, and movements of the related kinds, especially in Europe in the past, which is that those movements have almost always been explicitly authoritarian, anti-democratic, and anti-legalist. The radical right all over Europe had a hostility to the idea of the objective rule of law, second only, or possibly not even second, to that of the communists, leading, of course, in the end to the appalling nihilism of the Nazis, but also hostile to the idea of democracy, all attached in one form or another to the principle of an autocratic leadership, whether monarchical or the Führerprinzip, and so forth. Here it's very different, has always been different. It's not that this antithetical tradition in America, as Gunnar Myrdal remarked, is hostile to the ideas of democracy and the rule of law. It just doesn't, on the contrary, it's deeply attached to them. It just doesn't believe they're for aliens. It believes they're for us. Or, of course, this being America, for people who join us, who adopt our culture, who adopt our values, but mind you, don't just adopt the official values of the American creed, also adopt a whole range of cultural values as well. Join not just the civic nation, but also the folk, if you like, the folk, as Walter Russell Mead has called it. This attitude, I believe, was deeply shaped by the American frontier, but also by the experience of the White South, or at least what it took to be its experience, which is to say, extending the values, the principles of the rule of law and of democracy to blacks and Indians is pointless because their culture doesn't allow them to understand or follow them anyway, and is dangerous because they will use those values. If we then obey them in dealing with these dangerous aliens, they will use these values to destroy us. We'll lower our guard, we won't hold them down or defeat them, and we will be destroyed. Our civilization will be destroyed. And I heard recently a talk by, well, it was off the record, but shall we say he was a former senior legal official of the Bush administration with close links to the Christian right and to the frontier tradition. And he was asked about why the administration had chosen to adopt the military response, if you like, and also the military concept of the war on terror in response to 9/11, rather than treating it as an act by terrorist criminals and approaching it in that way. And what he said I found deeply striking in its language for a variety of reasons. He said, even if we could have prosecuted the perpetrators of 9/11, I mean, you couldn't obviously prosecute the people directly concerned because they were dead, but the planners, a few dozen lives for 3,000 is not sufficiently satisfying, that's his phrase. It's not an adequate compensation for a culture. And then he went on to say that we had to treat it as a war because only through treating it as a war was it possible to enlist, once again his phrase, the totality of the culture in the struggle. I must say, I hadn't heard the word culture used in that way since a few decades before I was born, and the echoes I found severely alarming, to be honest. I mean, in terms of retaliation, of course, what you have is explicitly the law of the frontier, the lex talionis, the law of revenge. Very much, as has been pointed out, the traditional code of the Scots-Irish in general, but also, frankly, the code of any armed frontier society faced by dangerous enemies or aliens with whom it, for whatever reason, finds it impossible to do a deal or to a compromise, you are drawn towards not justice, but simply retaliation. And of course, massive retaliation in order to try to destroy the enemy, or at least frighten him so thoroughly that he won't do the same thing again. But this mentality of the embattled frontier village, points in its ultimate logic, as the phrase "the culture" suggests, to the exclusion and even elimination, not just of potential enemy aliens, but of whoever within the society is, in whatever way, a dissident from the culture. A cultural dissident in this frame of mind is by definition a potential traitor, an actual potential traitor, to whom, once again, the law does not apply. Democracy and the law continue, but they don't apply to aliens. And I think this tradition has had a very considerable impact on some of the policies of the Bush administration in recent years, and the way in which they have been accepted by parts of the American population. Now, of course, the ultimate, well, not even the ultimate, but even the intermediate expressions of this mentality have not occurred in America. As I say repeatedly in the book, because of the strength of American democratic and civic values, of American civic nationalism, America has had this tremendous self-correcting mechanism, which means that periods of heightened chauvinism, of suspension of the law as regards people who are seen as dissidents or enemies, have not lasted very long. They've been followed by America returning, more or less, to the principles of civic nationalism and moderation. McCarthy was succeeded by Eisenhower. Or to put it another way, the minister and the trooper have gone on, staggering along together along the road of history, with the minister, the preacher, usually in the ascendant. And what has not happened is what would have happened in a great many countries faced with the various challenges that America has experienced over the years, which is that, frankly, the trooper would just have beaten the preacher to death and left him in a ditch. That hasn't happened. They continue to stagger along together. But a danger is there. And as many, many wiser people than me have pointed out, it has been considerably exacerbated by the nature of the war on terror and how it has been defined by the Bush administration. Because in terms of concept, for the first time in its history, at least in its national history as a whole, America finds itself in a war without end. All the previous wars have had an end, and whatever suspensions of liberty have occurred have then come to an end and been corrected. The Japanese internees could go home after the war. Now we have a war with no end in sight. The second thing is the nature of the struggle, because it should not be read from anything that I've said that I in any way underestimate the mortal threat of Islamist terrorism to Western societies and to our lives and those of our children. And in some respects, one can say that this replicates the conditions of the American frontier, in that you have a savage, completely ruthless, indiscriminate threat, not just to American soldiers, but to women, children, society in general. And in that context, it should be remembered that although I've said that in American society and in the nation as a whole, America has had a self-correcting mechanism in which it has returned from the suspension of the rules of law and from heightened chauvinism to the rule of law and to moderation. This was not true on the frontier. On the frontier, this sense of emergency and the suspension of law lasted as long as the frontier itself. It didn't end in Kentucky, then Missouri, or whatever, because the frontier had reformed itself. It ended because the frontier moved on, and it only disappeared completely from America, in terms of practice on the ground, with the end of the frontier itself. And therefore, in future, we do, I think, have a reason to be concerned and therefore very careful that the mentality of the frontier does not define American political culture and American behavior in future. Briefly, there are, I think, certain other reasons to be concerned. Not catastrophically pessimistic, just concerned about whether, from the point of view of the self-correcting mechanism, we may perhaps be living in a new age which doesn't resemble completely previous eras in American history. The first is the fact that although American society has been deeply divided in the past by religious allegiance over immigration, well, obviously over slavery, it hasn't been quite as divided, I believe, as it is today when it comes to fundamental religious values and ways of understanding the good society. There were, of course, tremendous divisions in America, fundamental shaping force in American politics for many generations, between the older Protestant populations here and the new immigrants, above all Catholic ones. But on the other hand, it wasn't that the older Protestant populations and the Catholics differed when it came to abortion, homosexuality, the nature of the family, what it is to be a man, in the end what it is to constitute a decent Christian society. They were very close. FDR did not have to run on a program of cultural liberalism against a Republican Party mobilizing forces of cultural conservatism. And so you do have an element in the American antithesis to an even greater degree than existed before of a real sense of embattled civilization, leading to really striking degrees of anger and bitterness and hatred, at least to me. The second way in which we may be living in a different world, and this takes us back to the origins of some of the darkest moments of European history in the past, is if it proves true that in the long run, the American economic dream is running out for the American white middle classes, or at least large parts of them. Perhaps those parts which in Europe we would call the working classes, the upper working classes. Because, of course, one of the aspects of America's self-correcting mechanism has always been that after periods of depression, America came back not merely to prosperity, but a prosperity which served, by comparison with, say, societies in Latin America or whatever, a very broad section, a dominant section of the American population as a whole. If, in the long term, parents from the middle classes not merely can no longer look forward to higher income, higher status for their children, but can with some certainty look forward to lower income and lower status, that could lead to some very, very important and dangerous results, in my view, in America, when it comes to the expression of this, both in terms of domestic political extremism, but also in terms of chauvinism abroad. And finally, there is, as I've said, the terrorist threat, something which America has not faced in this form since, in many ways, in America as a whole, since the days of the great French and Indian raids in the 18th century. And so I would say that we certainly do not need in any way to break with the American civic nationalist tradition as such, or to question its fundamental values, which are, as I've said, of inestimable importance, not just to the American nation, but of all mankind. We do, I think, need to question as rigorously as Lewis Hartz, as Richard Hofstadter, as Robert Bellah have done, some of the dangers and extremes into which an uncritical assumption of and undifferentiated assumption of the virtue of this tradition as a whole can lead America, both in terms of internal suppression of dissent, but also in terms of adventures abroad. And one critical reason for that is precisely that, as I think we can see now pretty clearly if we look, pursuing a program of messianic intervention abroad or of imperial domination justified in terms of spreading democracy, could lead to a set of historical consequences which will in the end gravely endanger not just the spread of democracy in the world, but also the preservation of democracy at home. And when one of the intellectual founders of this republic stated that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, he was not talking primarily about evil foreign enemies. He was talking about ourselves. Thank you.
Dr. Lieven, as I indicated, has agreed to take some questions from the audience. If you have a question, would you please find your way to one of the microphones in the aisle so that we can record them. It's very difficult for us to see you out there because of the glare of these lights, so you may have to speak up and wave your hand or whatever.
I appreciate your remarks very much. I particularly like the historical background because I think a lot of people, particularly in this audience, would think evil started with George Bush, but you were more inclined to maybe think it started with Crown. But something you didn't mention, but maybe would typify some of the things that we talked about, was Woodrow Wilson. He was the one that said we need to make the world safe for democracy. He was the one who, among the various incursions in Mexico, said we'll have to teach the Mexicans how to be good citizens. And he was the one under which we had 100% Americanism. And also, of course, Lloyd George and Clemens was a side of his moral superiority, which did help us typically American. So it didn't just start. Another brief comment, I thought it was interesting you mentioned people don't remember Louis Heights, Richard Hofstadter, or Gunnar Myrdal. David McCullough mentioned that when he spoke to a group of 20 Harvard history majors a couple years ago, not one of them referred to George Marshall. So
Yes.
we're pretty working our history in all degrees. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, yes, as I should perhaps have stressed more, this is an entirely bipartisan tradition when it comes to the belief in America's right and duty to spread democracy in the world. What, however, the Bush administration has certainly forgotten, or deliberately forgotten, in using the name of Woodrow Wilson, both to justify its own policies, but also, of course, to totally wrong-foot the Democrats, is that Woodrow Wilson had two intimately linked parts of his international program, one of which, and admittedly there were certain contradictions between them as they are in the entire notion of the United Nations, but one of them was spreading freedom and democracy. The other was, of course, trying to institutionalize peace and cooperation among nations through international law and international institutions. He was, of course, or wanted to be, one of the fathers of the League of Nations. You don't see much of that in the Bush administration. But it's also, there was a kind of descant you may have heard of to Woodrow Wilson's remarks about Mexico. When, sorry, my mind is going, I can't remember whether it was Pershing or somebody else, but I believe it was a British diplomat, went to an American general during Wilson's intervention in Mexico and asked him, but Mexicans don't have a very good record when it comes to establishing, a stable democratic state. What happens if, you put in one set of people and they, fail or they turn against you? And the American general replied, oh, well, we'll shoot them. And we'll get another set. And he said, but how long are you prepared to go on doing this? He said, oh, well, as long as it takes. We'll just go on shooting them, until... I think, once again, the Mexicans had a certain sense of this about American policy, and it made them a bit distrustful.
One of the implied promises of the invasion of Iraq was a stable Middle East with stable oil prices. Yet oil prices have tripled recently. And do you think that would be enough to get the American working class to rebel against the Bush doctrine of spreading democracy around the world?
Not alone, but it is entirely true, and it's something that I think the neoconservatives in particular forgot, that in the end, I've described, this tendency in American civic nationalism. It's equally true that the American people have always, I use that term very loosely, but a majority of Americans have never been willing to commit themselves to programs of international idealism if this is going to lead to sacrifice without end and with no clear end in sight. And so there has always been, a profound undertow, which we can see today as well, of pragmatism, of a foreign policy grounded in realism and the national interest. And in that, by the way, America is not alone. 19th century European countries were, of course, much more consciously imperialist than America is today. Much more consciously imperialist. But at the same time, they never, at least not if they were wise or could avoid it, used conscript soldiers for their imperial adventures, because the population was quite clear about this. They would accept conscription for the defense of the homeland. They were not prepared to see their sons conscripted and then sent off to fight in Africa or India or Indochina for imperial ends that they didn't understand in places they'd never heard of. And I think, one can see that factor at work here in America, not just in terms of opposition, obviously, to the draft, but also, even after 9/11, and it's coming back now, real doubts about whether American soldiers should be used for such purposes at all. Is there anybody over there? I'm sorry, perhaps you should go first, and then we'll go over. Sorry, the lights are rather bright.
I've always been conscious of how old the culture is in Europe and how new the United States is. So I was really pleasantly surprised by your point about that the American government model is sort of the longest living one of this kind of government, in sort of our immediate world. That was interesting. The other thing you talked about, though, was how we are constantly sort of reinventing and sort of investigating ourselves, growing ourselves. Do you think there's a way to make sure that continues?
On the first point, I have to say, once again, with due modesty, it wasn't my point. It's been a point made brilliantly by, interestingly enough, Samuel Huntington on the right, but also Richard Hofstadter on the left, the antiquity of American institutions. There's a quite brilliant essay by Huntington. I can't remember its formal title, but it's basically about America as a Tudor or late medieval English political system. Because his argument, which, I'm not enough of a late medieval historian to be able to judge, partly, but which is certainly provocative, is that the fundamental American governing and legal institutions were laid down in the 16th century, when England was still, in many ways a late medieval society, before the introduction of modern autocratic royal government in Europe, but also before the introduction of what in many ways was modern autocratic government by the king in Parliament, royal powers embodied in Parliament in England. And so, I can't go into great detail, but it's a brilliant, brilliant essay about how this, leads to divisions of powers, what it says about the nature of the American president, who, it must be said, a bit like a medieval king, can go to war very easily. That's what it's about. And, well, he can't actually strike off people's heads left, right, and centre, thank God, but is severely constrained when it comes to actually getting anything done at home, because of the way in which the whole system is deliberately fragmented. So just a sort of recognition of modesty. When it comes to the reinvention of America, Yes. You know, I mentioned that in this regard, America has an immense amount to teach the Europeans. Because, you know, this is now a central dilemma that Europe is facing. I mean, all the different countries in their different ways. And are having tremendous difficulty coming to terms with because of the nature of our nationalisms, which is precisely how do you take in huge numbers of immigrants from very different places and turn them into Germans, French, English, and so forth. Now, it should be said in defense of Europe, of course, we're facing a problem which America isn't, which is that in most of Europe, these immigrants are Muslims. Of course, maybe in America things would look very different if Mexico were a Muslim country. Yes, I think it would look very different. But anyway, as a model, the American model of using civic nationalism and adherence to these universal values to turn people into loyal Americans is a great force of hope, I think, for America in the future. It's worked again and again in the past. I believe that it will work again in future. And you know, that's why I'm at pains to stress always that you know, in drawing attention to the shadows, the dangers of the American tradition, I'm in no way suggesting that one should, you know, ignore its enormous virtues.
I wanted to thank you for coming. A couple things. I see a progression you mentioned McCarthyism and Eisenhower. At the end of Eisenhower, one of the last speeches he made, he noticed about the military industrial complex. And then I was curious, one thing at the end, if you've ever read position papers that were written in the late 90s by quite a few members of the current administration, a project for the Blue American Century. They said they needed a new Pearl Harbor grant to get to rally the people around. A couple of interesting things about that. On September 12, 2001, Jerry Hart, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, said maybe this will be able to bring about the New World Order, which, as he referenced, Bush Sr. had only mentioned once during his presidency. And that happened to be September 11, 1991. And there's been a lot of velocity moving about what happened on that day. NORAD standing down for the first time in history. Record put options put on 2 correct airlines. Government officials leaving. And then building number 7, which was 350 feet away, magically 47-story building magically exploded at 5 o'clock on September 11th. I'm curious, I think that this is all playing into what's becoming a cashless society. I just returned from Europe. I was talking to a banker in England, and she said they're giving little chips over there. Our Tommy Thompson was a Homeland Security Corps that's taking a chip now and it's working with the chip corporation, and that's being
I'm glad you mentioned Eisenhower because it brings out, you know, what we were saying about students. Very sorry, don't mean to insult the students, or if I do, I hope the Canadian border is close enough to get over it at some speed. I'm only talking about Washington students, you understand. Washington, D.C., not Washington State either. But I've made this little experiment, and it's wonderful. You know, I ask students who coined the phrase military-industrial complex. But by the way, just in order to offend everybody, apparently Eisenhower's original phrase was military-industrial academic complex, which means us, or rather, especially me, because I work for a think tank. But you ask most students this, and they say, oh, it must have been some radical. Not very radical, I think, poor old Ike, but much wiser than his successors. On what you said about 9/11, I have to say that I do not agree. And I am a strong opponent of conspiracy theories of this kind. Because not that I wish to make any comparison between, you know, environmentalists or people who care about the environment and American energy security and the neocons. But I'm sure that many of us, after Hurricane Katrina, have felt that, however dreadful this event and however, much appalling and often unnecessary suffering resulted from it, maybe at last this will wake up the American establishment, to think seriously about energy conservation and a new energy strategy. But that doesn't mean that we planned Hurricane Katrina, or that we would ever have done so. And I do not believe that, much as I disagree with them, that there are any of the neoconservatives or the American security establishment who would have been capable of doing that to their own country. Nor, incidentally, do I believe that if it had been done, it could possibly have been kept secret. Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, I lived for 7 years in the former Soviet Union. In all that time, I was bombarded with conspiracy theories about the KGB, how the KGB had planned this and the KGB had planned that, and the KGB knows everything, or, its successor, the FSB, and so forth, and the KGB is manipulating and planning everything. There's only one problem about this. If the KGB was really so intelligent and powerful, why did the Soviet Union collapse? Something which they quite obviously were not able to predict. And I covered the first Chechen war as a journalist, and one of the things that came out of that from, absolute personal observation was that Russian intelligence was absolute rubbish. They didn't have a clue what was going on. They couldn't have, as we say in Britain, they couldn't have had a conspiracy to organise a piss-up in a brewery. And I'm afraid, if you look at the record of the Bush administration when it comes to planning and organising things, well, it isn't much better. Look at this Brown fellow. I mean, the only way he could have destroyed the Twin Towers was by riding horses into them. It's really, and I'm against this as well because, there are enormous grounds, totally supported by clear, undeniable evidence, to condemn the Bush administration over the lack of preparedness for 9/11, apart from anything, the indifference to the Al-Qaeda and terrorist threat before 9/11, about the Iraq War, about what they've done to the preparations for emergencies and everything else, but trying to turn them into devils, into forces of absolute evil, which they would be if they planned this. Make no mistake. We would be ruled by demons if this were the case. That is, in a way, simply to echo, to mirror the worst aspects of their behavior, in terms of seeing the rest of the world, in terms of seeing critics within America as evil. And I really believe that this idea of the world as divided into absolute evil and absolute good is something which, for the sake of basic moral hygiene, but also the future of our countries, we need to get away from.
Just a quick question. With today's polarization and just how divided the country is, do you ever believe a third party would ever win a presidential election? If so, when?
Well, I mean, look, in terms of American history, if God grant American history continues, I mean, it must do at some stage. I take it we can hardly imagine that in 4000 AD, if human society survives, America will still be ruled by alternating Republicans and Democrats. I mean, but of course that can be a third party. It can also be a revolt in and transformation of one of the existing parties. Because after all, I mean, look at the Republicans. In critical aspects, they bear no resemblance to the Republican Party of Eisenhower, for example. Have fiscal responsibility? My God. And equally, I mean, the Democrats, the Democrats too were radically changed by the 1950s and, well, actually from the 30s to the 60s, from a party which had, after all, rigorously resisted for the previous century civil rights for blacks, very considerable change, and so forth. So I think it's bound to change at some stage. It's simply bound to. My fear is, however, that to bring it to change would require, and once again, I'm not hoping for anything of the sort, but would involve a massive catastrophe on the scale of the Great Depression, which ushered in the New Deal. And of course, there are two qualifications to this, one of which is, as I remarked, I believe, earlier today, the New Deal did not emerge out of Franklin Roosevelt's head. It was prepared for by almost two generations of American social and political progressive and populist thought, expressed, by the way, previously not just by the Democratic Party, but also at one particular moment by the Republican Party under Teddy Roosevelt. So when America faced this tremendous crisis of the existing capitalist order and the failure of the government as then configured to deal with it, America also had, in a certain sense, a plan in place. Not a plan that either the old Democratic Party or obviously the Republican Party of Herbert Hoover could have implemented, but a plan nonetheless, and a cadre of people who Roosevelt was able to call upon to implement that plan. I don't see that in America today. And if we want something like that to meet a future crisis, we damn well better start working on that now, because we may not have much time. In view of all the threats to the stability of the American and the world economy, we may need a plan like that much, much sooner than we think. The other thing is, of course, that if we don't have such a plan, if we don't have such a progressive tradition in place, there is absolutely nothing, historically speaking, outside America at least, to say that the force that will benefit from such a crisis, that will answer such a crisis, will be a force of the New Deal, a force of enlightened and progressive democracy. America got Franklin Roosevelt out of the New Deal. Germany got somebody very different. And in other circumstances, America could have got somebody like Huey Long or somebody like Father Coughlin. Not Hitler, of course, but not good.
How about two more questions, and please, questions only?
You mentioned the preacher and trooper without a robber in the name of corporate America. Could you describe?
I'm sorry?
You mentioned a preacher and a trooper. And I'm suggesting a robber, too, in the name of corporate America. Could you describe how they are affecting this American civil nationalism and our ability to address those 2 points on the economic crisis?
Well, as I said, my dialectical model was meant to be, I hope, a fairly useful and elegant image, not a rigid theoretical framework. So obviously, dialectics being, by the nature of things, dualist, I couldn't allow too many other characters in, or they would have spoiled my beautiful pattern. But of course, there has been an element of such robbery in America's, well, both in internal behavior and external behavior, summed up most famously by the American general, whose name I can't remember, who said that he'd basically been used in Central America on behalf of the United, as a gunman on behalf of the United Associated Fruit Company or United, I can't remember. Anyway, a fruit company. However, I think it's only part of the equation. I do not believe that the Iraq War was simply a result of Halliburton's desire for profits. I think that was a secondary aspect. There is another feature, though, of the American tradition, which I think is very important and which I am afraid, once again, may be changing. And that is that the American system has always been based on, to a considerable degree, limited and rational corruption, or patronage, if you will. I don't know if any of you have read this magnificent biography of Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro. But he brings out just how much the political rise of Johnson, from his origins in Texas, and the business rise of Brown and Root, now of course a subsidiary of Halliburton, were intimately linked in terms of Johnson getting Brown and Root construction contracts under the New Deal, and Brown and Root funding Johnson's political campaigns in Texas, and perhaps equally importantly, not just not just directly funding them, but using all its increased influence in Texas to make sure that Johnson got elected. Now, in one sense, of course, we would call that corruption in any other country in the world. But there is something very important to remember about the American tradition. You have to remember it about Brown and Root in those days. You have to remember it about Andrew Carnegie. You have to remember it about Rockefeller. You have to remember it about the railroad companies. The rise of all these corporations was deeply corrupt in many ways. But they did something which corporations, similar oligarchical, if you like, groups in other countries did not do, which is that they actually built the damn railroads. And Brown and Root built the dams, and they didn't collapse. They built the air bases in the Second World War, and you could use those air bases. They got the contracts corruptly, and I'm sure they took a few percent extra off it. But what they built stood. They were not kleptocrats, in other words. They were operating in a patronage system. Similarly, if you look at appointments in America, I mean, maybe I'm being naive and one does tend to romanticize the past, but I find it difficult to believe that any American administration over the past century, in circumstances resembling those of America after 9/11, would have appointed a totally unqualified political crony, a failure even in business, to head a crucial government department in terms of the threat to America. Similarly, Brown and Root, the part of the ancestors of Halliburton, they took these contracts during the Second World War, but they built bases that worked. It would seem from much proven evidence that Halliburton in Iraq has just taken the money very often and has built nothing that works. Now that is, if that's true, and once again, one shouldn't romanticize the past too much or indeed damn the present, but if this is a real change, then this is terribly dangerous because it marks a moral, an ethical, a cultural change in sections of the American elites from, as I say, a patronage system that works, you could say comparable to Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, to something which could come to resemble something much more like a Latin American or Filipino kleptocracy. Now, if that is the future, then we're in bad trouble.
One more.
Sorry.
Yeah, I really do appreciate the elegance of that dialectic between a civic nationalism and a chauvinism. And I'm wondering, just picking up on these latter questions of change and possibility, and you're just mentioning the elite's corruption, whether it's possible to put numbers on those principles where the civic nationalism and its universal values actually engage the sort of paradox of universal democracy, which is diversity in the name of universalism, on the one hand, which embraces all of those Americans who are not that civic phase, the descendants of slaves, the Native Americans, the diversity of the immigrant populations, versus a very small elite.
In terms of race, in the sense purely of color, it must be said that both American parties and America as a whole have, of course, moved a long way. And they've been able to do so, once again, because of American civic nationalism, because of the values of the American creed, which admittedly very belatedly, horribly belatedly, but eventually did extend themselves to blacks and Asians and non-Christian whites. And as I say, I mean, this is true of not just the Democrats, but after all, Condoleezza Rice is Secretary of State under Bush, and if you look at the Christian fundamentalist churches in the South, which were, of course, in the past absolutely color defined, you find, historically speaking, a surprising number of them now, very deliberately and consciously, reaching out to other races. And not just in terms of tokenism, but there does seem to have been a quite conscious change of heart. I cite in my book two extreme conservative Christian magazines have actually come out in favour, in praise of multiracial marriage, which is, after all, the ultimate taboo. By no means something that can have been easy for them, after all. The problem is, as I see it, twofold. One is, in the book, this lecture could go on forever, so I didn't talk about it, but I talk of America as a great civilizational empire. The true heir, in some ways, of ancient Rome, of China, which is to say that all these great empires have not been ethnically based. Their greatness has lain in their ability to assimilate. From very early in Chinese history, you had huge parts of the Chinese elite which were not ethnically Chinese by origin. Indeed, actually, the whole concept of an ethnic Chinese is ludicrous. This is not an ethnicity. It's a culture. You become Chinese by adopting the language now. And in the past also, if you were at an elite level, by adopting the values of the Confucian state system. Rome, of course, you adopted the Latin language and the values of Romanita.
Lieven. A most thoughtful and thought-provoking beginning for this year's President Lecture Series, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot.